It took 100 years to build the British Empire. It took 7 days to destroy it. In November 1956, the British pound was still the undisputed king of global money. It wasn't just trusted, it was feared. The pound was as good as gold. Then the Prime Minister picked up the phone. On the other end wasn't an enemy threatening war. It was the United States, Britain's closest ally, delivering a single ultimatum that would change history forever. Withdraw your troops from Egypt, or we sell the pound. That was it. No bombs, no soldiers, no invasion. Just a threat to dump British currency on the global market and collapse the economy overnight. By morning, Britain folded. The troops came home. The Suez Crisis was over. And in that single week, the pound lost its crown. The U.S. dollar took the throne it still holds today. Most people believe superpowers die slowly. They imagine a graceful decline, a gentle sunset, a peaceful passing of the torch. They're wrong. History shows us something far more brutal. The decline takes decades. The collapse takes days, sometimes hours. And if you look closely at the financial data coming out of the United States in early 2026, one thing becomes disturbingly clear. We're standing on the edge of that same cliff. The numbers are flashing red. The warning signs are everywhere. And almost nobody is paying attention. To understand 2026, we have to go back to 1914. Picture the world before the First World War. If you were a merchant in Shanghai, a banker in New York, or a trader in Buenos Aires, you kept your money in London, not because you love Britain, not out of loyalty or admiration. You did it because the pound was the global operating system. The British pound was backed by real gold, physical bars locked inside the vaults of the Bank of England. It was enforced by the Royal Navy, the most powerful military force the world had ever known. British law governed international contracts. British insurers protected global shipping. British banks financed railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, and factories in India. The pound wasn't just a currency. It was the infrastructure of global commerce. It felt invincible, and that's the first lesson history teaches us. Invincibility is an illusion. By the time a nation feels untouchable, the rot has usually already begun. The peak of confidence is often the beginning of decline. In 1914, Britain controlled roughly 25% of the world's land surface. The sun literally never set on the British Empire. But beneath the flags and parades, the foundations were cracking. Britain was about to make a decision that wouldn't destroy it immediately, but would make its collapse inevitable. They chose to fight World War I on credit. Here's what that means. When Britain entered the Great War, leaders believed it would be over by Christmas, a short, decisive conflict. They were catastrophically wrong. For years later, nearly 1 million British soldiers were dead. The nation had spent the equivalent of trillions of dollars, and almost all of it was borrowed. Before the war, Britain was the world's largest creditor. Other nations owed them money. By 1918, Britain owed money to everyone, especially the United States. They had sold their future to survive the present, and debts don't disappear. They compound. When you mortgage your empire to survive one war, you leave yourself defenseless against the next. Yet that's exactly what happened. 20 years later, Britain was back at war, this time against Nazi Germany. Once again, they fought with borrowed money. Once again, the bills came from America. By 1945, Britain had won the war, but lost something far more important, its financial independence. The country was effectively bankrupt, surviving on U.S. loans through programs like Lend-Lease and the Marshall Plan. And here's the part that should terrify every American reading this. From that moment on, Britain no longer controlled its own destiny. It had an empire. It had an army. It had history, but it didn't have leverage. And in the modern world, leverage is power. The British public didn't feel poor. In 1950s London, unemployment was low. The National Health Service was brand new, offering free health care to everyone. The government was building hospitals, schools, and council housing. Rationing had ended. Shops were full. To the average person walking down Oxford Street, the empire still looked alive and well. But financially, Britain was already dead. It was a zombie economy, moving, spending, functioning, but only because it was being artificially sustained. The appearance of prosperity masked a corpse. So, how does a bankrupt empire maintain the illusion of wealth? The same way empires always do, through financial engineering and the exploitation of trust. Britain was printing money to pay its debts, not openly, not honestly, but through thousands of small mechanisms that added up to the same result. Inflation simmered quietly beneath the surface. Prices crept up year after year. Savings lost value. Wages bought less. But slowly enough that most people didn't notice. The real trick, though, was something called the sterling area. After World War II, Britain could no longer compete with American manufacturing. It couldn't export its way back to prosperity. So instead, it built a financial cage around its former colonies. Countries like India, Australia, New Zealand, and dozens of others were required to hold their foreign reserves in British pounds. They were required to trade in sterling. In practice, this meant they were forced to buy British debt. Britain was financing its decline by exporting inflation to its empire. The colonies were paying for the mother country's lifestyle. And if this is starting to sound familiar, it should. For the past 40 years, the United States has run massive deficits. Trade deficits, budget deficits, deficits stacked on top of deficits. And who has financed them? China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and dozens of other nations buying U.S. Treasury bonds. We assumed they did it because they trusted us, because they believed in our system, because the dollar's dominance reflected American strength and virtue. Britain believed the same thing. They believed they could print money forever, maintain a global military they could no longer afford, project power they could no longer justify. They assumed the world would absorb the inflation, that their partners would keep buying their debt out of habit, out of inertia, out of a lack of alternatives. And it worked until it didn't. For the British pound, reality arrived in 1956. It arrived at a place most Americans have never thought about: the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is a narrow strip of water connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, cutting straight through Egypt. It is one of the most strategically important trade routes on Earth. Oil from the Persian Gulf, goods from Asia, commodities from Africa, they all pass through Suez. For decades, the canal was operated by a company controlled by Britain and France. Egypt was technically independent, but the canal was not truly theirs. Then, in July 1956, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, did something that stunned the world. He nationalized the canal. He took it back. To Britain, this was an insult, a humiliation, a direct challenge to the global order they believed they still controlled. And so Britain, alongside France and Israel, made a fatal miscalculation. They chose to invade. They would take the canal back by force. They would remind the world that the British Empire was still a power to be reckoned with. Militarily, it worked. British and French forces seized the canal zone within days. Egyptian troops were pushed back. On the battlefield, it looked like a decisive victory. But in the financial markets, Britain was being annihilated. Investors saw the reality immediately. A country already drowning in debt, running chronic deficits, now fighting a war it could not afford. They panicked. They sold pounds. They bought dollars. They pulled their money out of London. Capital fled the country. The Bank of England went into emergency mode. It burned through its gold reserves trying to fend the currency. Gold was sold. Emergency funds were spent. Every lever was pulled. Nothing worked. Britain was bleeding reserves at a rate that would bankrupt the nation in weeks. The math was merciless. At the current pace, Britain would be insolvent before Christmas. And then the phone rang. President Dwight Eisenhower was furious. The United States had not been consulted about the invasion. America was trying to win hearts and minds during the Cold War, presenting itself as a defender of freedom, not an old colonial empire. And here were the British, acting like it was still the 19th century. Eisenhower delivered a blunt ultimatum: withdraw immediately, or the United States would sell its holdings of British pounds. Britain couldn't survive that. They knew it. Washington knew it. The markets knew it. If America sold, Everyone else would follow. The pound would collapse. Britain would face a financial crisis. So severe it would make the Great Depression look mild by comparison. So Britain withdrew, not in victory, not in strength, but in humiliation. The empire wasn't defeated by an army. It was defeated by a margin call. This was the moment the world understood the truth. The pound was no longer the currency of a leader. It was the currency of a debtor, a dependent, a vassal. You would think that after such a reckoning, Britain would change course, cut spending, pay down debt, rebuild reserves, face reality. They did none of it. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortably familiar. After 1956, the British political class went into denial. Conservatives and labor alike spent the next decade pretending everything was fine. The pound remained pegged at an artificially high rate against the dollar. To defend that peg, interest rates were kept painfully high. Short-term loans were begged for from foreign governments. Capital controls were imposed to stop money from escaping. They called this defending the pound. What it really was prolonging the agony. They chose slow decline over honest restructuring. They protected national pride at the expense of national future. Now, fast forward to January 2026. Listen to the language coming out of Washington. Listen carefully. We hear about a soft landing. We're told the Federal Reserve has engineered a miracle. Inflation defeated without recession. Everything is under control. We're told a $38 trillion debt doesn't matter because we owe it to ourselves. As if the interest payments aren't real. As if compounding doesn't apply to empires. We're told the dollar is strong because there is no alternative. That it will remain dominant forever because no other currency is ready. That argument has been made before. Britain made it. Currency can match it. That phrase, there is no alternative, was a mantra of Britain in the 1960s. Politicians said it. Bankers repeated it. Economists built models around it. They could not imagine a world without the pound at the center of global finance. They couldn't imagine anyone daring to challenge it. What they failed to understand is this. Alternatives are created the moment the incumbent becomes a liability. They don't exist until suddenly they do, and then they're everywhere. In Britain's case, the alternative emerged quietly in the shadows. It was called the Eurodollar market, U.S. dollar, denominated deposits held outside the United States, beyond the reach of American regulators. No grand announcement, no treaty, no revolution, just capital quietly moving to where it felt safer. Within a decade, the Eurodollar system had reshaped global finance, and Britain's grip was gone. Now look at 2026. Central banks are buying gold at the fastest pace in modern history. China and Russia are settling trade in their own currencies. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their expanding membership, are piloting digital ledger systems designed to bypass the dollar entirely. These systems aren't ready yet, but neither was the Eurodollar market, until it suddenly was. The alternatives are being built quietly, patiently, in the shadows, waiting for the giant to stumble. For Britain, that stumble finally came in 1967. By then, the illusion was cracking. The economy was stagnant. The trade deficit was widening. Foreign governments were losing patience. Speculators smelled blood. They borrowed pounds, sold them for dollars, and waited. The government fought back desperately. Interest rates were raised to punishing levels. Billions were spent defending the currency. Loans were begged for from anyone willing to lend. None of it worked. On November 18, 1967, Britain surrendered. The pound was devalued from $2.80 to $2.40, a 14% devaluation. Overnight, every British citizen became 14% poorer on the global stage. Imports instantly cost more. Foreign debts instantly grew larger. British tourists abroad discovered their money bought less, without warning. The next day, Prime Minister Harold Wilson went on television. He looked into the camera and delivered one of the most infamous lies in financial history. It does not mean that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse, has been devalued. Of course it had. That was the entire point. The pound looked the same. Same paper. Same ink, same numbers, but it bought less. Food prices rose. Fuel costs surged. Living standards eroded. This is what a soft default looks like. No dramatic bankruptcy. No refusal to pay. Just silent theft. A slow erosion of purchasing power that punishes everyone who holds a currency, while quietly relieving the government of its debts. And this is the path the United States is far more likely to take. They won't call it a default. They'll call it an adjustment. They'll call it flexibility. They'll call it market forces. But the outcome is the same. Your savings shrink. Your wages fall behind prices. And the government's debt becomes easier to manage at your expense. But even that wasn't the end for Britain. The final humiliation came in 1976. By then, Britain was known as the sick man of Europe. Inflation hit 24%. Unemployment soared. Labor strikes shut down entire industries. The government literally ran out of money. They couldn't pay police salaries. They couldn't fund hospitals. They couldn't meet pension obligations. There was only one option left. They picked up the phone and called the International Monetary Fund. The former ruler of global finance was now begging for a bailout, and that was a moment the empire truly died. Britain went to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and begged for a bailout. The IMF agreed to lend Britain $3.9 billion. But the money came with conditions, brutal conditions. Britain was forced to slash public spending, cut social programs, impose austerity on millions of people. Think about that. A former superpower. The nation that defeated Napoleon. The nation that ruled a quarter of the world. Now being told how much it could spend on school lunches by a committee of accountants in Washington. This is the ultimate nightmare scenario for the United States. Not an explosion. Not a dramatic collapse. A loss of sovereignty. A world where creditors dictate domestic policy. A world where a nation can't choose its own budget because it owes too much to those who hold its bonds. So where's the United States today? We are squarely between denial and collapse. Look at the numbers. The national debt has crossed $38 trillion. It's growing by roughly $1 trillion every 100 days. This isn't linear growth. It's exponential. For the first time in American history, interest payments on the debt exceed the entire defense budget. Let that sink in. We are spending more to service our past than to defend our future. That is a mathematical definition of a debt spiral. When interest payments exceed investment, you're not growing. You're dying. We are also overextended. Just like Britain in 1956, the United States is juggling global conflicts with a military stretched thin, weapon stockpiles depleted, manufacturing hollowed out. The spirit is willing. The wallet is weak. And then there's the dollar. In 2022, when the United States seized Russian foreign reserves and cut Russia off from the SWIFT payment system, it sent a message to the entire world. The dollar is not neutral. The dollar is a weapon. And weapons can be turned on anyone. That single decision accelerated everything. The rush into gold. The search for alternatives. The quiet exit planning. Central banks aren't dumping all their dollars yet. That would crash their own portfolios. But they're reducing exposure, diversifying into gold, into other currencies, into anything that can't be frozen by a decision in Washington. So how does this end? Probably not with a war, not with an invasion, not with a dramatic confrontation. It ends with a Treasury auction. Picture a Tuesday morning later this year. The U.S. Treasury needs to sell $100 billion in bonds to pay the bills. This is routine. It's how the government keeps the lights on. Normally, the bonds sell. The money comes in. The machine keeps running. But this time, the buyers don't show up. Foreign central banks sit it out. Domestic buyers hesitate. The auction is uncovered. More bonds offered than bids received. Then it happens. Interest rates spike. If bonds won't sell 4%, they're offered at 5%, then 6%, then 7%. Each increase makes the debt more expensive. Each increase drains more money from the budget. And the market understands immediately. Investors see the spike. They know what it means. They sell, and the market drops. Confidence evaporates. The Federal Reserve is forced to step in. They become the buyer of last resort. Trillions of dollars are printed to buy bonds that nobody else wants. This is called monetizing the debt. It's what Argentina does. It's what Zimbabwe did. It is the last resort of failing empires. And when you print trillions of dollars, you don't get mild inflation. You don't get a manageable 3%. You don't get a temporary 5%. You get inflation that destroys savings. Inflation that devastates retirees. Inflation that makes a dollar in your pocket worth less every single day. That is how reserve currencies status dies. Not with a bang, but with no bid. The story of the British pound is tragic, but it is also instructive. Britain didn't disappear. The country still exists. London is still a major financial center. The British people adapted. They learned to live within their means. They became a normal country, prosperous by global standards, but no longer exceptional. What vanished wasn't Britain. What vanished was